Hello everyone, thanks for having me here today. Nice digs you have. I have come from Australia to spread the word about NEC, which is a great irony because we don't use it in Australia and I've never personally used it. So I'm delighted but surprised to be here. So this is effectively a in at the deep end, bit of an adventure. Let's see how it goes. Go easy on me. Thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about some stuff. Essentially, I'm a walking job advert for life in Australia because we are free of exciting things like Brexit and Trump. We have a lot of disposable cash and we have sunshine. So take this in the spirit it's intended. And given we are on the borderline of introducing NEC, anyone who knows about NEC is kind of warmly welcome with my business or within any business in Australia. So apply now. Other apologies before I get going. I speak really quickly. I've tried for decades to slow down, but I cannot. And I also am prone to swearing, so I apologise if I do. But it adds a little bit of jeopardy to the proceedings. So 3 things I've been asked to speak about. First is Australia's new normal, aka boom. The government is at great pains to point out that we're not going through an infrastructure boom because after boom comes bust. So what we want to do is actually get this as a stable infrastructure pipeline. So that's the first thing. The second is Partnering for Success, which is P4S, which is Sydney Water's, what should I go? First major initiative to use NEC in Australia, and I'll talk a bit about that. And then I will finish by outlining the opportunity for NEC in Australia and vice versa. So we'll run through those at a breakneck pace. All right, so for those of you who don't know, this is Australia from the end on. So just to kind of break with convention. And much of the activity, well, frankly, for those of you who have ever been to Australia or flown over Australia, there's kind of a whole lot of nothing. And life is really concentrated around the edges. And the edge that really matters is this one here, which is the Melbourne, or the East Coast, which is Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And that's about 2,500 kilometres from Melbourne to Brisbane. And for a long period of time, nothing much has really happened there. And I've worked there for 15 years and have been responsible for making a lot of that nothing happen. So I had a move back to the UK in about 2012-ish. And I worked for a company called Nichols. And a chap called Mike Nichols, who some of you may know, interviewed me. And he looked through my CV and there was billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of major infrastructure projects. And he said, this is really impressive. This is exactly what we need. How many of these have been delivered? And I was proud to say exactly none of them had been delivered. Now, that was not my own shortcomings. I like to think it was more the government's fault. And the government at that time had no money, but it had ambition. And what it did was spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars developing projects and then canning them. So we had a real great pedigree of project development, but hardly anyone had ever delivered anything, which equals a bit of a risk. Anyhow, so government, when I came back to the country, I like to take credit for it, but the change of government, and the government decided to invest in infrastructure, and they decided to invest big, but they had to find some money from somewhere. So what they did was sell off the family silver. So they started selling off the energy businesses, so the poles and wires businesses. And they got more than they expected from because pension funds really like long, safe returns. So they got kind of 20 billion a time for each of the energy companies. And what they embarked on was this thing which they call asset recycling, which I think is now being imported to the UK, where you create an asset, you sell it, you reinvest that money back into a new asset, and you create a sort of virtuous investment loop. Well, that's the plan, see how it goes. And so what they've done is they spent the first chunk of their savings on this thing called Sydney Metro. And Sydney Metro is, the total value-ish is about £25 billion, $50 billion. And that, the first stage of it, which is Northwest, got commissioned about 3 weeks ago. And this is the humble brag here, but it was on time, and it was $1 billion under budget. So if anyone here from Crossrail's watching, take note. Sorry, I'll leave. We used to, the front story, but we used to compete with Crossrail because they were ahead of us, and we've overtaken them, so we're a bit smug. But what it is the kind of the first driverless train system in Australia, and it's basically creating London Underground by sea. And it went really, really well, and so what the government decided to do is do a whole lot more of it. And so what you should have here is an animation of this mega pipeline of major infrastructure projects. So the turquoise ones popping up there are Sydney, there'll be some orange ones which are Brisbane, and there's some green ones which are Melbourne. And what you notice is there's some really bloody big projects there, sorry, swearing. And if the top one there, Sydney Metro West, is a 45-kilometre tunnel from Sydney to Western Sydney, which will cost about The official figure is a bit higher, but about $20 billion, so about £10 billion. And so New South Wales really sort of started the agenda. Brisbane went, well, it's sunnier up here, let's do some more. And then the Melburnians went, well, if you're going to do it, we'll do it too. And they've thrown their own pipeline in too. So the top project you see in the greens is the suburban loop, which is effectively creating the Circle Line. So it's $50 billion, so £25 billion. And what we've got then is this mega wave of infrastructure investment. So in New South Wales, there's £50 billion, $100 billion being spent in the next 4 years. In Victoria, there's $100 billion, £50 billion being spent in the next 10 years, and about half that figure in Queensland. So on the eastern seaboard of Australia alone, you've got £125 billion worth of major investments happening now. And they're happening quite well, but they could do better. So because, as I mentioned, we spent ages doing nothing, now we've kind of got this major delivery wave happening, and there's almost no capability in the market. So hence, job advert. And what that creates is a huge level of risk. So what you see here, hopefully, is you might think is Edinburgh Tram. This is not. This is Sydney Light Rail. It's our own version of stuffing up a major project down a major highway. And this is the CBD of Sydney. So this is like the main shopping thoroughfare of Sydney. And this was taken a little while ago on the day that it was supposed to be commissioned. And now that was about 2 years ago, and we're still going. And the project is about 2-ish years late, probably 3 by the time we're done, and it's 100% over budget. Now, those are pretty big numbers, but I'm really glad I'm partner in a construction claims business at a time like this. And what I'm being slightly glib, but I think it's probably the first of many claims that are going to eventuate in this market. Now, my hope is that we can actually cut off or stop any of those claims eventuating by getting the projects to happen properly. But this project was such a cluster that the New South Wales government embarked on a sort of commitment, a recommitment of intent to the construction sector, because we're just at the start of this boom, or this new normal, and actually we're already stuffing it up. So they created this thing, the Government Action Plan, and there's 3 points in there which are kind of particularly pertinent to what we're talking about here today. So the first is to procure and manage in a more collaborative way, to adopt a partnership-based approach to risk allocation, and to standardise contracts and procurement methods. So I think you're all there rubbing your hands going, this is it. This is the opportunity for NEC in Australia. And of course, what the government has now done is issued its own standard form of contract, which is entirely different. It's actually called GC21, Government Contract 21, and it is, I've got to be polite, it's not very collaborative. In fact, it's damn adversarial. And the real approach is to actually throw all the problems over the fence to the contractor. So what you have under that model is a Sydney Light Rail, where things are going very, very badly wrong. So there's enough POMs in Australia who've lived the NEC experience and have seen the benefits from it. So we've been pushing quite hard to invest in NEC. And so there was this first mover, and you always need a first mover, was this project here, which is the most Australian project you'll see today. What you've got there is orange earth and a project called the Great Northern Highway in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of nowhere. So it's in Western Australia, which is the furthest point on Earth from any civilization. And what they did was they chose a pilot project further away still. So if you see there, the most recognizable place on there is Carnarvon, which is 828 kilometers away. So if you think about the geographical isolation of this project, and the interface risk was not high. So surprisingly, this project went okay. Not brilliantly, but it went okay. But they did a few things not very well is the fact they didn't really engage, and they didn't engage with NEC. So the expertise resides, much of it, in this room, and so draw on it. So the project went okay, it wasn't a disaster, but it didn't really cement the case for NEC in Australia. So then what we needed was a new white knight, and that came in the shape of Sydney Water. Now, Sydney Water is, as you might guess, the water provider in Sydney, and they are the biggest utility in Australia, and happily, they're one of the more forward-thinking. So they were one of the early practitioners of alliance contracting, and they were the second delivery partner in Australia. So they really like to be at the front end. So they're the kind of perfect set of people to partner with. So we in HKA have been partnering with Sydney Water for the last 2 or so years, and will continue to do for the next couple of years, to build what is called this Partnering for Success initiative. So I just want to give you a quick case study on what we're doing. Now, Hopefully some of you will recognise this is Nick Baverstock. I don't know whether Nick's in the room before I say anything nasty. He's not. Good. Right. So one of the things we've done in Sydney Water, we've reconfigured their entire delivery and contracting model. And we've done that by mercilessly reappropriating IP from the UK. So we've used three things to do that. The first is NEC, and Sydney Water will become the first major enterprise in Australia to use NEC, and we're jumping straight in with NEC4, and we're going to outsource their entire portfolio using it. So it's like, really like a challenge. The second thing we've done is we are the first international early adopter of Project 13. So the project is aligned to Project 13 principles. We've spent some time with Dale Evans and the group this week just knocking it into shape. And we've also used the project initiation route map, which I thought everybody did, but it turns out it's not that widely used, but it's been an absolute lifesaver for us. So if you put those three things together, you get the DG on a plane, and you get lots of kind of positive thumbs up that actually Sydney Water is doing some really good stuff. So the problem statement was that Sydney Water spends, at the moment, about, what do they spend? About $9 billion on their capital portfolio in their AMP periods. And some bright spark either made a really brilliant business decision or a bit of a stuff-up a few years ago. And so what's happened is all of their contracts for all the services they procure are let through a number of framework contracts or panel contracts, and they all expire on the 1st of July next year. So you go, that's a bit of exactly that reaction. So a bit of a problem, but me being the eternal optimist went, well, this is a fantastic opportunity to do something about it. So do something about it we did. So they've got a supply chain with thousands of suppliers, and they let thousands of contracts each year, and they do almost on an individual case-by-case basis. They are typically siloed, like so many of these utility business, so planning throws the project over the fence to design, design throws over the fence to construction, etc. So you've got this really unintegrated model in a really transactional environment. So we can all say it's prime for change. So what we applied is this, which is the 6 pillars model, which I presume everybody's aware of, but if not, it's really good. It's part of the project initiation route map created by Martin Rowick, and we've used this to great effect on tons of projects actually out in Oz. And it is really a lesson in common sense, and that seems to be sorely lacking from a lot of projects I've worked on. So 6 pillars has really helped on doing some of the major and mega project development we've done, but actually what we focus on is engaging and talking. So we've spent about 18 months thinking, which is a fairly luxurious period for any kind of investment, but we've spent time thinking and talking and engaging. Because what's happened in the Australian market, because there is so much work, because there's this $250 billion pipeline, contractors are only interested in work that's actually worth it. So they actually choosing not to bid. So we did the market sounding for this $50 billion project a while ago, and we expected everybody to be biting our hands off saying, yeah, of course we want to bid it, we really want to be part of it. And actually what we had from the market was going, yeah, it's a bit risky, and actually there's another one in Melbourne which we'd rather do. So it's turned from the client saying, we want to buy this, and the supply chain responding, to the supply chain actually calling the shots, and that's a really major change. So that means when you're trying to procure something of this scale, the engagement is so important. So we've gone back and forth in terms of packaging and repackaging the works to make sure it's right for Sydney Water and right for the market. So through that engagement, we spoke to a lot of people around the world, which was fun, and we built a number of building blocks to really support what the delivery model should look like, and there's a ton there, but certain things which are really key features. So tenure was really important. So we basically said a 10.5-year contract was enough time for them to build capability over the period to actually drive better outcomes. And what was really refreshing about Sydney Water is that they recognise the first 3 years are going to be a write-off. They're probably going to be worse than current business as usual, or if they're as good as, that'll be a great result. But they're going to take 3 years to build the capability within the supply chain and then start to get the benefit over the sort of later 7 years. So big change. And the stuff that's really important to this conversation here is around risk allocation, collaboration. The market is, feeds to your point in terms of the market actually wants to collaborate, and how do we actually get that balanced approach, because the market needs certainty. So we're all about creating certainty for that market. And this is the point which is slightly contentious. So we want to have a collaborative model, but we also need some competitive tension in there as well. So we're going to award a 10-year or 3 10-year contracts, and we're effectively locking in the price now. So that's good for Sydney Water, not so good for the market. So we actually have to have some ongoing contestability within that. So through applying this process, we carried on following the 6 pillars, and we've built stuff which I think I always feel a bit sort of humble coming from Australia, thinking actually we're not as good as our UK brethren, but actually it turns out we're doing some stuff quite well. And so we've got a real clear articulation of what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve through P4S. We've built our scorecard, and we've built a really balanced risk allocation model, because Sydney Water, again, is mature enough to go, actually, we're the client. More times than not, we actually wear the risk, whether we pay for it up front or own it afterwards. So actually, a really balanced risk allocation was important. And then we spent a lot of time aligning the reputational and remuneration benefits of both Sydney Water and the market. So it's a kind of cake and eat it model where hopefully everybody wins. So from that, we come up with this thing, which is far too complicated to run through now. But essentially, what we're going to procure is these 3 kind of turquoisey bits in the middle, which are regional delivery consortia. And each of those consortium will be responsible for all of the design, all of the construction, all of the facilities management, and half of the maintenance in a particular region for the next decade. So it's a big lump of work, and it's about $15 billion. So it's getting a lot of market interest. And we've got 3 because it aligns with their current boundaries, but it keeps that commercial tension throughout the life of the model. Now, probably for the first 5 years, it will be collaboration between Sydney Water and the RDCs, but ultimately what we want to do is move to a model where it's fully integrated and actually getting basically creating a whole new business. So a long journey to go on together. So then this is the most boring part of the model, but the most important part in terms of getting the lawyers over the line, because I'm sure you probably have all encountered it, is that the opposition to NEC comes not from the users, as far as I've in all my years of experience of using it, it's actually the legal fraternity and corporate counsel. So we spent a lot of time with the lawyers and with counsel convincing them it was the right thing to do. And the aha moment for them was this thing which is shared purchasing. So 70% of the works will be delivered through the consortia, and then 30% will come through the supply chain or this shared purchasing function. And as soon as they understood that actually we could use the full strata of NEC contracts from the major projects through to the business as usual through to the supply chain, suddenly they were, oh, right, okay, well, we're fundamentally changing our contract model, and there's consistency right the way through from top to bottom. That was the real clincher from their point of view. So then as we spent probably several months building up the case for why we should use NEC. We had the immediate client who was really keen to use it, and we had plenty of people who had used it, but again, you have to create enough certainty that the board will move to it. So we spent a lot of time articulating what Sydney Water's drivers were. We really banged on about this 10-point action plan because it really played into our corner. And then we spoke to people. So we spent a lot of time talking to Anglian Water, to Crossrail, to TfL, to the New Zealanders that have used it, to the Western Australians that have used it badly, and to Project 13. So building up a picture of what worked and what didn't, and hopefully learning from others' experience to make it as good as it could possibly be. We actually toyed with doing an alliance, but that was they've really fallen out of favour in Australia, but that's a different story. And then we came up with this commercial model, which, I'll come to the commercial model in a second. What we came up with some rationale of why Sydney Water must move to NEC, and this is the kind of the abridged version. The grey box there is the real reason, is that all the water utilities in the UK use NEC. So Sydney Water liked being like its colleagues over here, and effectively was happy to ape that. But the key rationale that was kind of publicly stated is around aligning to government commitments, which I've talked about. It's an evolutionary step rather than revolutionary, and that's because they've actually been slowly moving to this more collaborative framework. So it's not such a major shift, which I imagine it was in Lima to Sydney. Lower cost. Now, again, this is one thing we're finding out. It's possibly not lower cost when you're doing it what the scale we have, but the costs often in Sydney are associated with bespoking contracts, and the lawyers have a cottage industry in changing contracts. So we've got a big upfront cost to get the thing going, but hopefully as we start to turn the handle on these contracts, then it becomes cheaper. Now, Sydney Water wants to be an innovator. I mentioned it's one of the kind of early adopters of Alliance, P13, and NEC. And I think what the fear was that if we, and this is why we've got FOMO on the slide, which is the fear of missing out, the least professional thing I put on the slide. But what we didn't want to do is lock ourselves into a decade's worth of contract and then come out the other side and the industry's moved to NEC and we haven't. So they want to be that first mover. And then minimising the risk of dispute it's important, but it's actually, I don't think Sydney Water's ever had a dispute. It's the nicest client on the planet. So then what we've created is this commercial model which creates effectively 3 regional frameworks. And it's a framework of one party in each region. And it's a contract between Sydney Water and these regional delivery consortia. And I'm not sure under the rules in the UK we can actually get away with it, but we're still a banana republic, so we can. And what we're looking to do through these frameworks is drive year-on-year efficiency improvements. And so we're targeting one number behind the scenes and publicly targeting about 5% year-on-year efficiency savings, which is a big number, but actually can be readily achieved, not just through NEC, but for actually driving this commerciality through a decade contract and driving innovation. And this is, it's probably a little bit hard to read, but this is the way we've conceived and configured the contracting framework. So you have an NEC4 framework contract sitting at the top, and then it's been Australianised, and we've had Peter Higgins and Ian Heafy helping with that. I'll come to that in a moment. And that's, so you have the framework with the Z clauses and adding things like Security of Payments Acts and Nice Weather and GST into the mix. And then all the works that the consortia deliver is under these, under ECC for options A to E for capital works, TSC and PSC for all operations, maintenance and facilities management. And then with the management of the contract actually comes from an overarching PSC. And then again, through the supply chain, they're all hooked on the same form of contract. So this is the genius of someone in my team, I can't take credit, but I will, was that where Western Australia failed is they tried to do it on their own. And they tried to Australianise and Z-clause the hell out of this thing to make it resemble their standard form of contract as much as possible. We didn't really know what we were buying. They engaged the top-end town lawyers who did their very, very best to un-NEC it, and it basically became GC21. And it just so happened that the lawyers writing GC21 were the lawyers we used. So what we did was we picked up the phone to, I think Reka was probably the first port of call, and it's been very helpful, and Peter Higgins has been supporting in the background in a nice, subtle way to tell the lawyers to shove it, because essentially the intent from the lawyers was to say, mutual trust and cooperation when we feel like it. So everything they possibly could do to get it to reflect what they normally did, but with an NEC cover on the front, is where they were going. So we're still not quite there yet. We're at the pointy end of negotiations, and I think the contract will go back somewhere near where we want it to be, but we're reliant on expertise from within this room to really help us on that journey. All right, so I'm probably going to run out of time. So in terms of the journey, we were on ridiculous timeframes. So we've been consulting for 1.5 years, and then we're going to prosecute this $15 billion contract in 9 months. So quite tiring work. And the reason we're doing it so quickly is because we recognise there's this transition journey to take out the existing parties, bring in the new parties, and then to train up Sydney Water so they're actually sufficiently competent to get the benefits from the model and to be able to administer NEC. So a massive change programme that undertaking. This is the dartboard of optimism. There's far too much detail on it, but I think you've got the slide pack. But again, this is just to say that we're targeting quite big efficiency savings and trying to drive innovation through it. So again, really clear on what we want at the end result. And so then in terms of next moves, so it's been really interesting since we broke cover on P4S, on LinkedIn and press releases and stuff like that, the number of phone calls that have been received in this building and been received in our offices about how do we use NEC, can we use NEC, can we have a conversation about it? Suddenly everybody is talking about it. It's just you needed that catalyzing first mover. And they're all going, well, thank God someone took the plunge before us. Let's see how it goes. And it comes down to, if we don't get Sydney Water's P4S initiative to work, NEC in Australia is going to have a really hard time establishing itself. So what we've got to do amongst ourselves and Sydney Water and with NEC is to throw the kitchen sink at getting it to work. And if we get it to work, the whole market has got the tendency to move. So I won't name names, but we've had a lot of conversations with some of the world's biggest miners who are really keen to move to this because they see the value in collaboration. And the transport organisations and other government organisations in Australia are now starting to be keen. So again, nail Sydney Water and then we'll be good. So in terms of next steps, I'll leave you with a lovely picture of Sydney. It's pretty much my morning commute in, but not by helicopter. The kind of key takeaways are to act now. Like I've really emphasised quite how much money's being spent. It's really hard to kind of get the sense of it from over here, but honestly, it's so phenomenally busy. So we've got to really invest in making sure Sydney Water succeeds. We've got to continue to build support and interest amongst government and big miners and the like, and we're talking about establishing an NEC users group and presence in Australia to really kind of give that full-time support and drive to get it going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dafydd.